It was the kind of town where people lived quietly, hidden in the trees of the forest. I had been born and raised here, with a life marked by normal routines and the occasional town meeting. The forest surrounding the town was thick, dense, and vast, a sprawling wilderness that felt both protective and suffocating. People avoided the forest, especially during the week between Christmas and New Year's. That time of year had always felt strange. The air would grow colder, harsher, and the trees seemed to groan under the weight of something that wasn't quite visible but was always there, lurking. The elders of the town would always say it was just the winter chill, nothing more. But the truth, if anyone was willing to acknowledge it, was far more unsettling. When I was younger, I remember hearing hushed conversations at family gatherings, warnings about a creature that appeared every 20 years in town, a creature that would rise from the heart of the forest, a towering, inhuman figure, one that no one dared speak of aloud for fear of attracting its attention. The Warden, they called it, though no one had ever truly seen it and lived to speak about it in detail. Its appearance was said to be a towering mass of ice and frost, a living glacier that moved with a terrifying precision, as if it was aware of every step it took. The elders never spoke of it in specifics, only through vague rules and rituals passed down for generations, rules that the town had learned to obey with careful devotion. I'd listened to these rules over the years, a mix of superstition and old-world caution that kept the town safe, or so we hoped. The first rule was simple enough. Scatter crushed bone dust mixed with ash across every entrance to your home before sunset each night. The dust was meant to keep the Warden from entering. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it always slowed it down. If you heard its approach, you had a chance to hide. The second rule, the one I thought was the strangest, was about raw meat. Every time you left your home, you had to carry a piece of raw meat in your pocket. If the temperature dropped suddenly, you had to throw the meat as far as you could and run in the opposite direction. It wouldn't be fooled for long, but it could buy you precious time. The third rule was simple but terrifying. If you heard the faint chime of bells outside, you had to kneel immediately and pray that the Warden didn't choose you. At this point, trying to run would guarantee your end. And the fourth rule, the most mundane of all, was to carry salt in your mouth. At all times, outside, no exceptions. It was supposed to dull the Warden's ability to sense you. But if you swallowed it or spat it out before you were safely inside, it could easily get to you if it wanted. That was the part no one wanted to think about, but we all knew the consequences. But there were rules about things you couldn't do. The first was obvious. Don't bleed. Fresh blood could draw the Warden from miles away. If you cut yourself, if you scraped your skin, you'd have to be careful. You couldn't let a drop of blood touch the ground, or else you would be its target. The second rule was that you couldn't sleep in a bed with legs. The Warden was said to be able to hide beneath beds with open spaces underneath them. The mattress on the floor was your only safe option. Even better is to just not sleep, but that's impossible. The third rule was that you couldn't acknowledge it. If you saw its blue glow through the trees, you had to look away. Looking at it would make it charge at you, and it would choose you, and no one wanted that. The final rule was the one that everyone struggled with the most. Never leave fresh tracks. If you walked through the snow, you had to erase your footprints as you went. If the Warden saw tracks, it would follow them and it would track you down. It didn't matter if you were inside. If you were safe, it would find you. For the past few weeks, I had lived in a mix of dread and disbelief. The week between Christmas and New Year's was drawing near, and the atmosphere had already begun to change. The air was colder, but not in a normal winter way. It was sharp, biting, like something was waiting, something hungry. And the warnings, the whispers of the warden, grew louder. I had always been skeptical, but as the days passed, I could feel the tension creeping into every conversation, every glance. The warnings played over and over in my mind as I walked through the quiet streets of the town, every step crunching softly against the icy ground. It wasn't quite snow yet, but the frost clung stubbornly to everything. Branches, rooftops, even the windows of homes where faint candlelight flickered behind thick curtains. The town felt unnervingly still, like it was holding its breath. No one was out unless they absolutely had to be, and even then you could see the tension in their hurried steps and the way they clutched their coats tighter. The forest loomed on all sides, its dark outline blending with the gray sky, and though I'd walked these streets 1,000 times before, they suddenly felt alien, as though they belonged to something other than us, something watching. I was headed to my aunt's house on the edge of town, tasked with delivering a box of supplies, things like salt, crushed bones, and ash. My family had taken the rules seriously for as long as I could remember, but my aunt was notorious for waiting until the last moment to prepare. I couldn't risk her forgetting this time. The box felt heavy under my arm, and I kept one hand shoved deep into my pocket where the raw meat rested, wrapped loosely in butcher paper. The cold air stung my face, and I could feel the grains of salt pressed against the inside of my cheek. It was uncomfortable, and the urge to spit it out crept in more than once, but I didn't dare. Not now, not this close to the forest. The closer I got to her house, the more I could hear the faint groan of the trees, their branches creaking as if weighed down by something invisible. I tried not to let my mind wander, but the rules kept repeating in my head, growing louder with each step. Scatter the snow, keep the meat, kneel for the bells. The thought of breaking any of them sent a shiver down my spine, and I quickened my pace. As I reached her door, I could see the faintest smudge of ash along the threshold, scattered haphazardly as though she'd done it in a rush. It wasn't enough. My hands trembled slightly as I set the box down and began spreading the mixture in a clean, deliberate line. My breath came in quick puffs, the frost from the air curling around my face. Suddenly, I thought I heard something faint, like the whisper of wind through the trees, except there was no wind. I froze, straining to hear, but the sound didn't come again. Not yet. My aunt opened the door just as I finished, her face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't be out after dark," she said, her voice low and tense. She looked past me into the forest, her eyes lingering on the shadows that stretched unnaturally long in the fading light. "Come inside, quickly." I didn't argue. Inside, the house was dimly lit, with curtains drawn tight and every surface covered in odd trinkets that my aunt swore were protective charms. A small pile of firewood crackled in the hearth, but the warmth felt feeble, as though the cold outside was trying to seep in through every crack and crevice. She offered me a cup of tea, but I declined, unwilling to risk swallowing the salt in my mouth. "How bad is it this time?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away, instead busying herself with double-checking the locks on the windows. Finally, she turned to me, her expression grim. "The signs are stronger than I've ever seen," she said. "The trees are louder. The cold, it feels alive." She hesitated, then added, "I heard the bells last night, faint but close, too close." A chill ran through me. The bells were the one thing I'd hoped never to hear, and the thought of them ringing so near made my stomach twist. "Did you kneel?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded, her eyes flickering to the small shrine she kept in the corner of the room. a haphazard collection of old candles, wooden carvings, and a worn leather-bound book of prayers. I did, but I don't know if it saw me. Her words hung in the air like a weight, and I found myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a faint blue glow in the distance. The warden had always felt like a story, something to keep children from wandering into the forest, but the fear in my aunt's voice made it feel all too real. I stayed with her for a while, helping to reinforce the doors and windows, making sure every inch of ash and bone dust was intact. When I finally left, the sky was a deep, bruised gray, and the air was colder than it had been when I arrived. The walk home felt longer, every sound amplified by the silence around me. My footsteps seemed too loud, and I found myself dragging a branch behind me, erasing my tracks as I went. It was slow, painstaking work, but I couldn't risk leaving a trail. Not tonight. The raw meat in my pocket felt damp, and I couldn't remove the feeling that something was watching me. I told myself it was just nerves, that the forest wasn't as close as it seemed, but the unease grew stronger with each passing moment. Then, just as I reached the halfway point between my aunt's house and mine, the temperature plummeted. It wasn't gradual. It was sudden, sharp, as though the air itself had turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat, and my hand flew to my pocket, clutching the meat tightly. I didn't wait. With a trembling hand, I pulled it out and flung it as far as I could into the trees. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I'd been wrong, that nothing was there. But then I heard the thing. A faint crunch of snow, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction where I'd thrown the meat. My heart pounded as I turned and ran, my legs burning with the effort of moving through the icy terrain. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The rules were clear, acknowledging it, seeing it would seal my fate. All I could do was run, my chest tightening with fear and the cold as I prayed I'd make it home in time. The sound of footsteps faded as I reached the edge of the town, and I stumbled through my front door, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I checked the locks, the salt fully dissolved but still against the inside of my cheek. For now, I was safe, but the air outside was still heavy, still cold, and I knew this was only the beginning. The safety of being inside my home was a fragile illusion, but it was all I had. My chest still heaved from the sprint, and every muscle in my legs felt taut and ready to collapse. I leaned against the door, the rough grain of the wood pressing into my back, and listened for any sound beyond it. The only thing I could hear was the faint crackle of the fireplace in the other room and my own unsteady breathing. The silence outside felt wrong, too still. I forced myself to move, to focus on the rules. The crushed bone dust across the threshold wasn't disturbed, but I added another thin layer, just to be sure. My hands trembled as I spread it, careful not to spill any inside, where it could lose its potency. It felt colder than it should have been inside, and I glanced toward the windows. Frost had begun to creep up the glass in strange random patterns, like claws dragging themselves across the panes. My stomach churned as I checked each window, pulling the heavy curtains tighter and double-checking the locks. I tried to distract myself by lighting more candles and throwing another log onto the fire, but every creak of the house made my pulse race. The cold had settled deep into the walls, into the floor, as though the air itself had been replaced with something unnatural. It wasn't just the winter chill. It was sharper, heavier, like a weight pressing down on the entire house. I thought I could hear faint whispers. They were so soft they could have been mistaken for the wind, but the more I listened, the more I felt they were something else. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, but the tension refused to leave. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I'd been followed. I replayed the events of the walk home in my mind, searching for anything I might have done wrong. The footprints, had I erased them all? I thought I had, but doubt clawed at me. The meat, I threw it far, didn't I? Far enough to distract it? The questions buzzed relentlessly in my mind, and with every passing minute, the unease grew sharper, more oppressive. I was pacing the living room when the first sound came, a faint, distant chime. My heart stopped. The sound cut through the air like a blade. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my pulse. Another chime, closer this time. My knees threatened to buckle as the realization set in. The bells couldn't be. They were never supposed to get this close, not if I'd followed the rules. But the sound was unmistakable, and it was drawing nearer. I dropped to my knees without thinking, the action instinctive, drilled into me by years of whispered warnings and half-forgotten prayers. My hands clasped together tightly, and I squeezed my eyes shut, muttering the words my aunt had taught me. The prayer felt clumsy on my tongue, rushed and uneven, but I forced myself to keep going, to drown out the panic rising in my chest. My breaths came in shallow gasps. The chime rang again, closer still, and this time, I could feel it reverberate in my chest, a low hum that settled deep in my bones. The air grew thicker with each passing second, until it felt as though I was kneeling on a sheet of ice. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, then sputtered out entirely, plunging the room into near darkness. My breath came in shaky clouds, visible even in the dim light of the candles. I didn't dare open my eyes. The rules were very clear, acknowledging it even accidentally would seal my fate. Another chime, so close it sounded like it was coming from just outside the window. My body trembled violently, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but I stayed frozen in place, whispering the prayer over and over like a mantra. Then the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief, foolish moment, I thought it might be over. But the stillness felt wrong, too heavy. The frost on the windows began to spread faster, curling across the glass like living tendrils. A faint blue glow seeped through the curtains, soft at first but growing brighter with each passing second. My heart thundered in my chest as I fought the urge to look, to peek through even the smallest gap in the fabric. The glow pulsed, casting eerie shadows across the room, and I could feel its presence, massive and oppressive, just beyond the walls. A sudden noise broke the silence, a deep, resonant creak, like wood bending under immense pressure, came from the back door. My stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't checked it since I'd gotten home. I scrambled to my feet, moving as quietly as I could, and crept toward the kitchen. My hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists to keep steady. The back door was visible now, and my heart sank. The line of bone dust and ash was smudged, as though something had pressed against it. The doorknob rattled, a soft, deliberate sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. I grabbed a handful of ash from the pouch on the counter and began to spread it across the threshold again, my movements frantic but precise. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, the only sound was my own labored breathing. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. They crunched through the frost with an unnatural rhythm, pausing every few steps as if listening. My pulse raced as I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the pouch of ash like a lifeline. I could hear it now, the faint hum of the blue glow outside, growing louder with each step. It was circling, searching, and every fiber of my being screamed that it was only a matter of time before it found a way in. The footsteps outside were relentless, circling the house with deliberate slowness, each crunch of frost underfoot hammering the same thought into my mind. It knew I was here. The blue glow outside the windows pulsed faintly, its light creeping through every crack in the curtains, shifting across the walls like liquid. I stayed pressed against the kitchen wall, clutching the pouch of ash with trembling hands, barely able to breathe. My mind raced, frantically replaying the rules, searching for anything I might have overlooked, some way to keep it at bay for just a little longer. But the warden was here, close, and there was no more room for mistakes. The next sound made my blood run cold. A low, guttural scrape, as though something sharp was dragging across the outside of the walls. It moved slowly, purposefully, traveling the perimeter of the house. My stomach twisted as I realized it was testing the structure, searching for any weakness, any gap in the barriers I had so carefully laid. My gaze flicked to the back door. The line of bone dust was intact now, but the smudge I had seen earlier lingered in my mind like a taunt. Had I repaired it too late? Did it know? The scraping noise stopped abruptly, plunging the house into a suffocating silence. For a moment, I dared to hope it might have left, that it had given up. Then came a sound that shattered that fragile hope entirely. A faint, rhythmic tapping against the window. It was so light that it could almost have been mistaken for the wind. But I knew better. My chest tightened as the tapping continued, steady and unyielding, as if it was waiting for me to look, to break the most dangerous rule of all. I clenched my eyes shut, forcing myself to stay still, to resist the primal urge to look. The tapping stopped, replaced by the sound of wood creaking. My heart lurched as I realized it was coming from the floorboards, inside the house. I bit down hard on my lip, stifling the scream that threatened to escape, and clutched the pouch of ash tighter. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't heard anything cross the threshold. How was it inside? The cold intensified, wrapping around me like a vice, and the faint chime of bells echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The floorboards creaked again, closer now. I opened my eyes just enough to see the shadows shifting across the wall in front of me. They moved unnaturally, as though the glow from outside was bleeding into the house itself. My grip on the pouch of ash faltered, and it slipped from my fingers, spilling across the floor in a soft cloud. My pulse spiked as I scrambled to grab it, my movements clumsy and desperate. And then it happened, the moment that sealed my fate. In my panic, my hand caught the sharp edge of a splintered floorboard, slicing clean through the skin of my palm. I hissed in pain, instinctively jerking my hand back, but it was too late. A single drop of blood fell, striking the floor with a soft, almost imperceptible sound. For a moment, nothing happened. The house was still, the air thick with a dreadful quiet. Then the bells stopped. The glow outside vanished completely, plunging the room into a darkness so deep it felt alive. A growl broke the silence, vibrating through the walls and into my chest. It wasn't outside anymore. It wasn't testing the house, circling, or waiting. It was here, and it was coming for me. The cold grew unbearable, sinking into my bones, and the sound of footsteps returned. But this time, they were heavy, deliberate, and heading straight for the kitchen. I stumbled backward, clutching my bleeding hand to my chest. The shadows on the walls twisted violently, forming jagged, impossible shapes, and the faintest hint of blue light began to seep under the doorway. I backed into the corner, the spilled ash crunching beneath my feet. The door to the kitchen groaned, the wood splintering under an unseen force, and I realized with chilling clarity that there was no escape. The warden didn't need an open door or an invitation. It had me, and it knew it. The last thing I saw before the door gave way was the faint blue glow of ice, sharp and blinding, flooding the room. The air filled with the sound of cracking frost, of splintering wood, and of something massive stepping into the house. And then the bells began to chime again, louder and more relentless than ever, as the darkness closed in around me.